Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 30. Epilogue. 6 months later. Does this ever get easier? I groaned, swiping a hand over my forehead. A thin sheen of sweat clung to my skin, running from temple to temple. There wasn't one specific person I spoke to, rather the entirety of my friends and family that had gathered for this historical event. Naturally, my eyes strayed to my mate, the beacon that never once failed to lead me through the dark. His lips quirked up at the side, eyes sparkling with significantly less shadows than before. He was slowly learning to forgive himself for the deaths of our pack members. I wish I could say it does, but I'd be lying. Zeke let out a cheeky snort. Way to make her feel confident. You've got this, Lola. You're a natural. Brianna peeked her head from around Giovanni's massive shoulder. Besides, if you choke you can always work a little magic and make everyone forget about it. Ha! With my luck I'll get a little too magic happy and make the whole pack forget about me. A genuine chuckle slid past my lips as my friends continued with their playful banter. I was quickly pulled into the arms of my mate, whose embrace I accepted with a blissful sigh. His lips schemed my ear, brewing all sorts of thoughts that were not suited for tonight's events. Zeke's right, though. You were meant for this. You won't choke. After all, look at all you've accomplished. I placed my hand against his taut chest, tapping the thick pad of muscle I felt just below his shirt. All that we've accomplished. I corrected him. I would have never been able to do this without you. Maddox looked as stunning as ever, playing the part of alpha to near perfection. He, like the rest of us, were dressed in a mixture of both professional and casual attire. While we needed to step into our roles tonight, we also needed to present an air of comfort and unity to make the witches and vampires in audience feel right at home. After all, it wasn't just a few witches and vampires in audience. It was all of them. Well, almost all. Those who wanted to voice their opinions, lend their hand in shaping this new future that would cater to us all, stood in attendance. Truthfully, I couldn't have done any of it without the help of two unlikely allies. I swear, that child gets all her sass from you, Ember. Angelica used to be a sweet, docile thing before you got to her. Tessa scolded her sister as the two of them entered the room. Ember kicked the door shut behind her with the sharp heel of her boot, and began to take in the contents of the room with a hand propped on her hip. A quick flick of her eyes over the velvet furniture, hand-woven rugs, and paintings hung in golden frames, was all she needed before cocking a sculpted eyebrow at her sister. Please, do you even know Angelica? She's never been sweet or docile. The kid's a menace. Ember exclaimed with a suspicious amount of warmth to her voice. Paired with the cocky tilt to her lips, one might assume she almost liked Angelica. She's not the only menace I know. Tessa shot back, not an ounce of venom in her voice. Her eyes schemed the room seconds later. She let out a small sound of appreciation. This place is beautiful. The room we stood in was one of many at the Seven Springs Country Club. While everything was a bit extravagant for my tastes, it was the only place big enough to hold a meeting this size. Compared to the pack-wide announcement we had well over a year ago, revealing the truth about our alliance with the vampires, this was the biggest event our kind has ever held. I approached the twins with radiant warmth. 6 months ago, I had a long list of suspicions and doubts, but one by one these girls managed to cross them all off. We weren't yet best friends, but I could see the road we walked down and knew that with time and patience, I'd eventually trust these two with more than just my life. I'm so glad you two made it in time. I beamed, Truly relieved. Ember sniffed, flipping her thick mane of fire-kissed hair over her shoulder. Well, as the ambassadors of the witch community we couldn't very well miss tonight, could we? A laugh rumbled in my chest. Even though she'd sooner lock herself in a dark room with Brandon than admit it, her words, not mine, I knew she was becoming just as fond of me as I was of her. Tessa's soft eyebrows matched that of her smile. Ever the diplomatic twin, she reached out and grabbed my hand, giving it a quick squeeze. We wouldn't miss this for the world. Before the conversation could truly take off, the door opened once more. Maddox's beta, who had been on leave these past 6 months doting on his pregnant mate, peeked his head into the room. "It's showtime, folks," he drawled, flashing me a gruff smile as though he could see the raw nerves throbbing beneath my veins. I let out a sharp breath and shook out my hands, visualizing the stress leaving my body in heavy waves. It would never cease to amaze me how I'd rather be neck-deep in battle than speak in front of a crowd. But hey, we all had our weaknesses. Maddox and I stepped out into the hall, our entourage following closely behind. It was there, beneath the sloped ceilings and crystal chandeliers, that we met up with Tristan and Holly. Tristan, who I had recently denounced as my first in command, greeted me with a warm smile. Seeing as he and my sister were now an item, I figured I should no longer come as his first priority. Holly was still a princess, after all. And a princess deserved a mate that would look after her and her alone. Which is exactly why I promoted Tristan to head of the Royal Guard. Only instead of protecting me with his life, he'd protect my sister. The two of them looked the part. Tristan, with his navy button-down and dark slacks, matched the sparkly cocktail dress Holly had on, one that showed her lithe figure and subtle curves. "Are you ready for this?" she asked in her soft, melodic voice. After spending the last 6 months with an actual therapist, she had grown in strength. Her entire demeanor had changed, and it was truly a sight to see. She no longer hid from the world and had even found friendship in Clara. I bumped my elbow into hers, returning the friendly smile she flashed me. "As ready as I'll ever be. She's going to do amazing, and she knows it. Doesn't hurt that she has a bunch of witches, vampires, werewolves, an alpha, and a princess backing her up." Clara chimed in, a vision in her sea foam maxi dress. When paired with her dark skin and curly hair, it made her look she'd emerged from the very depths of the ocean. Mason, with his matching button-down, had an arm wrapped around her waist. The haunted light that came with losing your fated mate was nowhere to be seen. In fact, he looked more at ease than anyone else here. Catching my eye, his lips quirked up in his usual cheeky grin, one I couldn't help but return. "I believe it's time. Unless you want to be late to your own event," Tristan said smoothly, tilting his head towards Maddox's beta, who waited by a set of towering double doors. Doors that would lead outside, to the massive crowd I knew was waiting. Nothing could have prepared me for how many heads there were. It was all too easy to see them all, considering we had to carve a path through the crowd to make it to the very center of the field. Technically, the neatly trimmed grass that surrounded us was the country club's golf course. All 27 holes were packed with people. Since things were still a bit rocky, the crowd was divided by species, each cluster set with their own handful of guards for protection purposes. It was our goal that someday the crowd merge as one. Maddox and I led the way, following a path of silver silk laid on the ground to the very center of the field. Since it was the dead of night, lamp posts wrapped in ivy sat scattered throughout the grass. Behind us was Holly and Tristan, followed by Brianna and Giovanni, Zeke and Tessa, and then the others. There was no stage waiting for us. I didn't want to stand above the masses, to look down on them as though they were beneath us all. What I wanted was for them to see that regardless of species, we were all equals here. Several feet in the air was a large screen that would soon feature all of our faces. The speakers scattered throughout the entirety of the golf course would ensure our voices were heard far and wide. My skin prickled from the sheer number of eyes turned our way. There was always the risk of this ending badly, but surrounding ourselves with an army of armed guards would not support the idea that this meeting was to discuss terms of peace and unity. Each one of us had a headset with a microphone that would cast our voices across the sea of people. There wasn't a single one of us more important than the next, and tonight would prove that. Every voice, every idea, every suggestion, would all be heard. Squaring my shoulders, Maddox and I led the others into the circular clearing where finally, history would be made. Maddox and I stood front and center, while the others formed a half-circle around us. For several minutes, chatter rippled throughout the crowd. Waves were thrown left and right, which we reciprocated with equal enthusiasm. Once the excitement died down, I spotted an opening and promptly took advantage of it. Welcome, everyone. We cannot thank you all enough for coming here tonight, I said warmly, sweeping my arms out at my sides. The heat that was Maddox's presence loomed over my shoulder. I craned my head to look up at him, flashing him an intimate smile as he stepped forward and bellowed his own welcome. Never before has an alpha had the honor of welcoming so many into his pack. No matter where the future might take us, this is a moment I will not forget. Everyone here, regardless of your background, will be treated with the same respect as a pack member. Should any issues arise, I ask that you come directly to me. Now, with that out of the way, I'm going to let my incredible mate, and queen to quite a few of you, take the stage. Wiping my sweaty palms on my dress, I took a deep breath and let my thoughts and emotions flow freely. Today is the first day we work towards the future that not only sees all three of our species as equals, but as allies, as friends. Many injustices have been committed against your kinds, against vampires and witches, and as much as I wish I could, I cannot erase the past. What I can do is promise that tonight it ends. I bellowed. I paced the length of the circle marked as our stage, looking each and every person in the audience in the eye, taking them all in and seeing them for who they truly were. The camera projecting our faces onto the big screen swiveled as I moved. Vampires stared out at me, both dark and pale-skinned. Witches, with eyes sparkling with magic, gifted me their full attention. Werewolves, wearing various levels of shock on their faces, watched with rapt interest. As you all can see, my friends and I here have many differences. We come from different backgrounds and have endured a wide array of things, but not one of us is more deserving of compassion and respect than the next. I don't expect this to be easy. In fact, I expect it to be the hardest thing I've ever done, but I won't give up. I will earn your trust every single day that I choose to fight for you, and for your right to live in the way that you see fit. An eruption of cheers spouted from all sides, from all corners of the field. It rippled over each and every one of us, thickening the air with something sweet, something that felt an awful lot like hope. As it died down, I addressed the crowd a third time. Love, no matter its source, is always welcome. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to my friends. Hear their voices, their stories, and know that each and every one of us are on your side. I retreated into Maddox's arms, winding our fingers together as Holly and Tristan took center stage. Pride swelled in my chest as my once timid little sister spoke to a crowd of thousands. With her chin held high, Holly told her story, leaving nothing out. Afterwards, an eruption of cheers sounded. Next came Tristan, who earned every single shout, clap, cheer, from the vampires in the crowd. Brianna and Giovanni came next. My best friend spoke with such emotion, unraveling the secrets behind what was once a forbidden love. There wasn't a single dry eye in the crowd. After Giovanni's turn, it was time for Tessa and Zeke to take the stand. One by one, my friends shared their stories, the mistakes that they've made along the way and the displays of bravery they showed that ultimately led us to where we were today. Every single emotion was evoked until both the sharp sting of grief, and the warmth that was joy, rippled amongst the crowd. As each one finished, they took a stand beside the other, until we were all side by side. To the future, I shouted, thrusting my fist into the air. Where every story matters, where every story will be heard. A split second of silence rang out before the explosion that was thousands of vampires, witches, and werewolves cheering. One by one, their fists were raised, kissing the stars and the moon that looked down on us all. And finally, history was made. Lola and Maddox. 1 year later, it was hard to believe how much time had passed, even as I stood at my own wedding reception, surrounded by the people I loved most in this world. So much had changed in 365 days, and it wasn't just my marital status. There had been some uprising within the other packs in the country, but with Zeke as an ally and assuming leadership over Bran's pack, they were easy to defend ourselves against. The packs that wanted nothing to do with this new world closed themselves off, shutting their gates and increasing their security even though we had no intention on retaliating. It would take time before those packs changed their ways of thinking, and despite what they believed, violence was not the answer. Rather than wage war, we focused on our own lands and doing all that we could to welcome any vampire or witch that needed a place to call home. Towns similar to the vampires' safe haven were currently being built on neutral territory. Never in a million years could I have guessed the identity of the vampire spearheading the entire thing, but I was slowly learning to love surprises. Speaking of which, well, look at this. I don't think I've ever seen you look more like a queen. Deacon's grisly laugh rumbled throughout the massive tent my reception party was being held under. He emerged through the crowd of werewolves, vampires and witches that attended. The mixture of our kind brought a lightness to everyone's hearts. That had Maddox and I grinning at one another throughout the night. Spence and Dina wanted to make it, but their little one is still learning to control his bloodlust. Won't be safe to have him around for at least another 6 months. It's not a problem. They're welcome over as soon as their boy is able. I'm looking forward to meeting him. He'll have all the support he needs when he's finally of shifting age. I replied. Wrapped around Deacon, wearing a floor-length gown of maroon silk, was his mate Bridget. She quickly winked in my direction before scoffing at my brute of an uncle. The two would pick at one another relentlessly, but the love and adoration between them was all too obvious. I disagree completely. You saw her put that force field over our town last year. Now that's what I call a queen. Her giggle was warm and airy. She placed her hand on my arm and said, "You look gorgeous, Lola. The gown is incredible." Maddox insisted on having it custom made. In fact, he insisted on spending the most amount of money he could get away with. I commented dryly, glancing at the man in question. Lucky he has such good taste then. Bridget winked. A voice sounded to the far left, beside the bride and groom's table that Maddox and I sat at. It brought a grin to my face, filling my chest with unimaginable warmth. Tonight was easily one of the best nights of my life, and it was partially because of this person. Oh, don't let that brooding alpha tell you he planned this get-together. He might have signed the checks, but the masterpiece surrounding you was a team effort. Grandma's huff was nothing short of stern, but the soft tilt to her features exuded playfulness. If we let these brutes have their way, they'd likely host a fighting ring right here on the dance floor. She quickly wrapped me in her arms, whispering her congratulations in my ear before moving on to Maddox. Since getting out of the hospital a few months ago, Grandma had been even more affectionate with Maddox than usual. I like to think it was her way of reminding him he wasn't to blame, and despite the stoic way he held himself, I knew Maddox enjoyed the affection. Now that sounds fun. Wouldn't mind duking it out a round or two. Someone has to teach these young pups how to hold their own. My dad's voice came next, still just as raspy but lighter than ever before. Deacon's laughter was a sonic boom that made the people closest to us jump. While it was startling at first, there was something infectious about it. Within seconds, we were laughing alongside him. "Can't say I'd mind knocking some heads," Deacon said, sharing a grin with my dad. "Good to know it's not just the werewolves that can be brutes." Flora's soft and whimsical voice trickled through the crowd. She waddled her way past the other party-goers, her stomach round and swollen from the life she carried. In her hands was 2 plates stacked with pastries and various finger foods. Upon seeing her, Dad rushed to her side to take the plates from her arms. There was an adorable blush that stained her cheeks when she realized everyone was looking her way. Claire, Maddox's mother, appeared from the woodworks. She and Flora had become close friends over the past year. Between Claire and I, we'd been there throughout the entirety of Flora's pregnancy. It was the least I could do considering my little sister was a short 2 months away from being born. I was pulled into Maddox's arms, missing the playful jab Deacon tossed back at Flora that had everyone breaking into laughter. Everyone seemed to be holding their own conversations, jumping back and forth whenever someone poked fun at another. It was chaotic in the best way possible, and I enjoyed taking a step back to watch the madness unfold. Claire and Bridget were holding their own conversations when I caught Flora's eye. As I took her in, noting the mossy gown that hugged her body and showed off every inch of her rounded belly, I decided that pregnancy suited her. Maddox's silken lips schemed my temple before moving to whisper in my ear. "Do you regret it?" Dad approached Flora from behind, stopping to rest his chin on the top of her head. His arm slid around her waist, his hands coming to rest on her swollen stomach. There was this dreamy look on my dad's face that I'd never seen before. The euphoria it filled me with was indescribable. As I looked over her pregnant belly, thinking about the life my magic helped create, I realized I already had my answer. Not one bit. Little did I know that 9 months later, I'd be welcoming my own child into the world. 2 years later. "I'm going to kill him," I hissed, clenching my teeth as another jolt of pain racked my insides. I'd suffered through evil in many forms, became a Luna and a queen, but it was this that threatened to take me out. The pain of this little gremlin in my stomach, kicking and fighting to make her grand entrance into the world, was nothing short of excruciating. If it wasn't for Holly and Brianna, I'd be waddling my way to the hospital alone. "It'll be okay. It'll all be okay." Holly, ever the peacekeeper, said soothingly. She had her arm wound around my waist as she supported my right side. I couldn't tell if the words were to calm me or to calm herself. Brianna, who supported my left, barked out a laugh. "I'll help you kill him." Together, they hoisted me into the van, easing me into the seat. Between my swollen ankles and the contractions, I could barely move without writhing in pain. "Help me and I'll make you alpha," I groaned, falling back onto the seat. There was a handful of heartbeats in between each contraction, and that number was quickly dwindling as they grew closer and closer together. Brianna started sucking in slow breaths, puffing them out in awkward patters that she expected my agony-riddled mind to follow. She'd been studying childbirth the last 6 months, and while I absolutely loved her for it, I had to resist the heinous urge to clamp my hands over her mouth to stop the huffing and puffing. "Drive faster!" I howled at Giovanni, who clenched the steering wheel so tightly his tan skin turned white. The stronger the pain became, the more time seemed to slip through my fingers. Looking back, the moments leading up to giving birth would come in sporadic flashes. Holly, sitting at my right, dabbing my sweaty forehead with a damp washcloth. Brianna, whispering words of encouragement to remind me what a bad bitch I was. Her words, not mine. And finally, the rage I felt towards Maddox because he and Zeke chose this moment to go and visit the Council of Witches elected to oversee the magical community, just 2 towns over. In his defense, he didn't know my water would break just 6 hours after his departure, but when you're in the middle of contractions those details seem to slip through the cracks. It wasn't until I was in a birthing room at the hospital, with no less than a dozen staff members flitting about, that Maddox tore through the door. From where I laid in bed, snarling at anyone who came too close, I could see the line of visitors piling up just outside the room. At the front of the crowd was Dad, Flora, and their daughter, Penelope. Grandma stood at their side, flanked by Maddox's parents, Zeke, Tessa, Brandon, Ember, Tristan, Mason, and Clara. The others at their back were hospital staff or overly excited pack members hoping for a glimpse at the future Alpha or Luna. "You're late." I meant to snarl the words at Maddox, to convey how furious I was, but a vicious contraction tore through me so sharply that the words came out in an agonized yelp. Maddox skidded to a stop at my side, wasting no time as he smoothed the hair away from my face. There was pain burning in his eyes, but it was overshadowed with awe and the innocent kind of joy that came with watching your child come into the world. His hand found mine, toying with the rings on my left hand. He made no mention of how drenched in sweat I was, and instead whispered in my ear, "You're absolutely beautiful." Brianna leaned over the side of the bed, forcing a straw into my mouth. Her stern expression told me to drink, and despite the pain tearing up my spine, I obliged. Only she and Holly were permitted in the room, considering they were the only 2 I'd allow near me. Call it instincts or the horrors of the past, but some animalistic part of me was already attached to this child and skeptical of anyone who tried to come close. "I'm so sorry, baby. We got here as quick as we could." "I'm glad we got here when we did," he panted, still drool-worthy with his hair disheveled and hospital scrubs hanging off his muscular form. If I wasn't in such pain, I would have peed myself laughing when Maddox, naked as the day he was born, rushed into the room. The doctor, a kind woman whose name I'd already forgotten, guided my feet onto this metal contraption that left me white and very much exposed to the entire room. She rolled a stool over and situated herself front and center stage. With every contraction, I unleashed my full strength on Maddox's hand, spitting and snarling as the pain surpassed any and all thresholds. My incredible mate didn't balk, not even once. Through every one of my death grips, he murmured words of encouragement and reminded me that even covered in sweat and gasping for breath, I was the thing he treasured most. "All right, Luna. Are you ready to push?" the doctor asked, peering up from between my legs. I bit back a snarl. "Do I have a choice?" "No, you do not," she said, though not unkindly. "With that, let's begin." The doctor began counting softly, instructing me when to push and how hard. The nurses, who kept a healthy distance, kept a monitor on my vitals. During contractions, they'd gone over breathing techniques and how I should employ them as I pushed. At first, I hadn't been paying much attention, but I guess my brain stored the information somewhere because the second I began pushing, all of their tips rushed to the surface. Pain, so much pain that it shouldn't have been possible, drilled its way through my body, carving a path that ended at the junction where my legs met. My own voice rang in my ears, loud and shrill, higher than I'd ever heard it before. I'd kill for some painkillers. I cried out, but it was useless. Morphine and epidurals were meant for humans, not werewolves. In any other situation, I would have forced my magic into reality, carving my pain out of existence, but since becoming pregnant my magic had been wonky, to say the least. Maddox, doing what he could, attempted to distract me. "Do you still think it's a girl?" he asked. We hadn't gone through with a gender reveal. Both of us wanted to be surprised. Gritting my teeth, I answered with utmost certainty. "It is." The lights in the hospital room began to flicker. Within seconds, the nurses started chittering nervously, their eyes flitting to the corners of the room. In the midst of the agony of my daughter clawing her way into the world, I noticed the shadows that had slithered into view. They clung to the outskirts of the room, very much visible as they closed in. Their attention wasn't on me, but on the sharp squeal that came from between my legs as I pushed one final time and forced our child into the world. "She's so beautiful," Brianna hiccuped, her cheeks red as tears streamed down her face. "She has your hair, Lola. A full head of it." "It's a girl," I gasped, locking eyes with Maddox. My mate stared at the small bundle swathed in a little pink blanket with nothing short of awe, his eyes glossy and flecked with brilliant gold. The doctor cradled our daughter, the future of our pack, in her arms before passing her over to a nurse. My heart stuttered as I reached out for my daughter, but before I could utter a command, the doctor was once again in between my legs. A sharp slash of pain split my stomach in two, traveling down, down, down. It felt like a contraction, only worse. That wasn't possible, though. It couldn't be. The shadows hadn't left yet. They were still there, creeping closer as they watched with silent interest. "Oh! What's happening?" I cried out, frantically looking Brianna and Holly. Holly's face paled as she stood behind the doctor, peeking over her shoulder. When Brianna joined her, I thought my friend might faint. "Oh my goddess!" Brianna gasped. Holly's eyes flickered up to my own. "You're not done yet, Lola. There's another coming." Seconds and minutes bled into one cacophony of pain. Voices merged into one, drowned out by the screams that I still couldn't quite believe were coming from me. It could have been hours that passed for all I knew. When a second wail hit the air, I was completely void of energy, fighting sleep. With every breath I forced from my lungs. The shadows had retreated to the corners of the room, whispering in feverish voices that I only managed to catch snippets of. The doctor raised her head, her eyes watering as a smile graced her lips. "Congratulations, Alpha and Luna. It's a boy." 3 years later, Holly's POV. The breeze was blissfully cold against my skin, the sunlight a slight tingle that rippled over my exposed arms and shoulders. Winter was approaching, tainting the air with its crisp scent. No matter how much I ventured outdoors and basked in the sunlight, I wasn't sure I'd ever get enough. Even though I burned easily, thank you, vampire genetics, it was a wonderful taste of freedom that I'd never take for granted. The shrill screams of children playing pierced my ears. I didn't find it irksome the way some of the parents here did. Despite how loud they were, their wails were full of joy and innocence that could never be replicated or replaced. I looked up from the stack of papers in my hands, focusing on the children racing across the mulch just 10 feet away. The tiny font had been giving me a headache for the past 2 hours now. "Honey, you need to stop and tie your shoe. You're going to trip and fall." The woman on the bench beside me shouted, wrapping her pea coat tighter around her waist when a breeze traveled through. A little girl with sable pigtails halted in her tracks, her head turned in the direction of the woman's voice. She got down on one knee, and tied the laces of her sparkly tennis shoes before taking off towards the monkey bars. Someday soon, Lola's twins would be running around this very playground. Just last month we'd all gathered for their first birthday. A daydream began to form in my head, painting an idyllic picture that felt like it belonged to some other girl and not myself. It wasn't just Lola's twins running amok, climbing the jungle gym to race down the spiral slide. They were accompanied by another child, a little girl with Tristan's golden hair and my pale eyes. I shook my head, clearing the image from my mind. No matter how many therapy sessions I attended, there was this cloud of guilt that followed me, looming over my head and blotting out the sunlight. Lola deserved her happily ever after. She'd fought tooth and nail for it. I didn't fight for anything, yet here I was with a wonderful mate and a future ripe for the taking. I wasn't entirely sure I deserved any of it. Another hour passed before the woman stood from the bench and corralled the little girl into their arms. Now alone, I basked in the warmth that kissed my skin, wishing it would ease the ball of nerves in my stomach. I glared at the stack of papers on my law *P and sighed heavily. These would have to be dealt with. There was no one else to pass them off on, unfortunately. A shadow passed in front of my face, erasing the sun from view. I craned my head up to see Clara standing over me, a hand propped on her curvy HP. Her lips were tilted in a knowing smile. How can someone look so miserable on a day like this? She drawled before plopping down beside me. Ha! I laughed, then held the stack of paperwork out for her to see. This is how. Another breeze kicked up, whipping my hair around my shoulders. Clara's curls bounced happily. Having straight, fine hair was becoming a curse all on its own. Clara winced. Ouch! Yeah, that doesn't look like fun. What's it for? Shifting on the bench, I passed her the stack of papers. Her eyes skimmed over the words several times. I couldn't blame her for not figuring it out quite yet. The words printed were long and monotonous, drawn up by a lawyer with a far better education than I'd ever received. After a few seconds, I lifted my hand and tapped on a symbol at the top of the first page. It was a medieval-looking crest with a raven at its center, closed by a sword and a spear. Clara's eyes flickered over the coat of arms before gasping excitedly. No way! It's actually done being built! She exclaimed, her lips pulling back into a smile. The way she grabbed my hands and squealed helped ease the ball of anxiety in my stomach, but only slightly. I still had this mountain of paperwork to deal with. The magisterium, as Tristan and I named it, was the world's first ever academy for the magical arts. When I presented the idea to Lola, she was absolutely ecstatic. I hadn't wanted to put more on her plate, so I told her I'd take control of the project. She and Maddox gave me everything I could have ever needed to kickstart the thing. The academy was now finished being built, and with its shiny new halls and state-of-the-art classrooms, the doubts began trickling in. It is, but we've still got a long way to go before the place is up and running. I murmured with a heavy sigh. Taking the paperwork from Clara's hands, I stared down at the mess of permits, contracts, and employment applications. Clara's features softened with concern. She pursed her lips, placing a hand on my shoulder to snare my attention. Hey, what's wrong? You should be excited. This is everything you've worked for. It is, I trailed off, biting the inside of my cheek. I just don't know what I'm doing anymore. I mean, seriously. I'm not equipped to teach. I barely know enough about my own magic. This was my idea, but now that it's complete, I have no clue what to do next. You know, I'd love a teaching position myself. Clara said, quickly trailing off. She hummed thoughtfully, her eyes flicking over the paper and the stack of applications I had to deal with. Startling me, she squealed and jumped up from the bench. Her hands were on my shoulders before I could think to react. There was a cheeky grin on her face, and a strange light in her eyes that I wanted to uncover. What is it? I asked, a hint of skepticism bleeding into my voice. I have the perfect idea on what you can do. She exuded smugness, which only made my curiosity worsen. More than anything, I wanted answers on what to do next, on what direction to take my life in. I sat up straighten, holding back the desperation that swelled in my voice. Well, what is it? How does Headmistress Holly sound? She asked, a mischievous twinkle in her eyes. It was hard to believe that was 1 year ago, but as I walked down the main hall of the magisterium, my heels clicking against the freshly steamed tile, I couldn't imagine myself anywhere else. The girl who lacked confidence, who was afraid of the world and all it had to offer, was slowly dwindling away with each day that passed. I still spoke with my therapist, but it was now on an as-needed basis. This entire time, I had a support system. I'd been too wrapped up in my head, too angry at the mistakes I made in the past, to dare reach out and claim it. Headmistress Carl, the janitor, said warmly. Smoothing the cobalt blazer I wore, the one with our crest embroidered on the pocket, I returned his smile. Good morning, Carl. Ready for the new school year? Oh, I'm ready. These little hellions won't get me this year. He laughed, pulling out a small fire extinguisher from his cleaning cart. As hard as I tried to stifle my laugh, it slipped out without warning. I promise you, there won't be a repeat of last year. Regardless, I'm glad you came prepared. Poor Carl was the target of a fiery mishap last year from one of our younger elementals. The girl hadn't meant to hit him in the shoulder, but his clothes went up in flame, nonetheless. Thankfully, after a few after-school training sessions, there were no further incidents. No worries, Headmistress. They're young and bound to make a mistake or 12 before getting it right. Carl winked and continued down the hall. He was such a good sport, and all too understanding with the witches at the academy. The work Lola and Maddox was doing was slowly paying off. There were significantly less issues this year than ever before, and the werewolves in this pack were slowly warming up to the idea of coexisting. I continued on my warpath of going over this year's roster. Listed on the papers I held in my hand were the students and their respective classes. Alongside their individual subjects were the teachers that taught them. If only I'd known that becoming headmistress meant I'd eat, sleep, and breathe paperwork, I might have not taken Clara's suggestions so seriously. Speaking of Clara, I looked down at the mess of papers in my hands, searching for the number to her classroom. After finding it on page 3, I traveled down the length of the hall which veered to the left to end in a large square. There was an additional corridor down the center that led to my personal office, which is where I'd retreat afterwards before heading home to Tristan. He'd been a bit disgruntled leaving my side whenever I went to the academy, but I was slowly learning to control my magic and could handle myself for the few hours I was away. Thanks to Brianna, our resident librarian, I now had more texts than ever on blood magic. My sister's best friend had traveled half the country so far, discovering hidden texts and manuals on different kinds of magic. She's one of the many things keeping this place together, and even volunteers her time at our second location, which opened just this year. I peeked my head in Clara's classroom and was greeted by a wave of laughter and cheers. With Maddox and Lola funding the place, we had enough money to build large classrooms full of color. The beanbag chairs and rolling tables were anything but conventional, but the children loved them. Crystal sun catchers hung from the ceiling, casting rainbows along the floor. That was a personal touch of Clara's, one some of the other professors replicated. Clara stood at the front of the classroom, swiping a stick of chalk over the blackboard. As I entered the room, effectively stealing the attention of her class, a grin swelled on her face. The ankle-length skirt she wore swished in a sea of pattern and color, matching her tank top and the lilac eyeshadow she painted on her lids. Well, if it isn't our wonderful headmistress! Say hello, everybody! Many of the budding witches cupped their hands over their mouth to shout, while others were a bit more reserved. A chorus of hello, headmistress rang out into the room. Hello, everyone! Are you all excited for the start of the school year? I asked, sweeping my eyes over nearly a dozen heads. The girls in the class were virtually all of the same age. Here at the magisterium, we grouped classes based on skill level. All that mattered was that these young pupils were beginners. At the end of their third year, they'd be evaluated and sorted based on their individual magical callings. After their excited string of yes died down, I turned to Clara and waved the roster sheet that I held in my hand. Oh, new students! Let me see! She chirped, ushering me over to her desk. Plucking the paper from my hands, she glanced up at her class. Girls, chat amongst yourselves while the headmistress and I go over this year's roster. Oh, and no magic! Clara's lips twitched as she looked up at a little girl with chubby cheeks and golden hair. Locking eyes with her, she shouted, "That especially goes for you, Angelica." The little girl in question nodded rapidly, her lips threaded in a thin line. As soon as Clara's head was turned, her eyes scanning the class roster, Angelica spread her arms and unleashed a cloud of crystalline butterflies that sparkled as they crossed into the beams of sunlight permeating the room. Before I could think to say anything, a small hand appeared at my waist. The little witch it belonged to had dark skin and a head of curly hair. She tugged the front of my blazer to get my attention. "What's her name?" the little girl asked, eyes bright with curiosity. It was a bit odd, but I ignored the twinge and replied, "You know who I am, silly. My name's Holly." The girl shook her head, her curls bouncing around her shoulders. Clara looked up from the roster and tilted her head. We shared a confused, but curious look before the girl's hand slid from the hem of my blazer and came to rest on my stomach. "No, headmistress. I'm talking about the baby." 4 years later, Clara's POV. "Don't you dare, little witch!" Mason warned in a low voice. A shiver worked its way down my spine when he placed his hand against my back. Even through the thin fabric of the dress I wore, I could feel the heat he exuded. One of the first things I'd learned about werewolves was that they ran hot. Despite how hard I tried, a smile worked its way onto my face. My chest quite literally ached with the urge to cackle, but I couldn't help it. "It's not my fault." Tristan's expression was absolutely to die for. Even Lola was having a hard time containing herself, snickering behind her hand as she watched the scene unfold. Tristan had been locked in place for the last minute and a half, staring at Holly like she had grown 3 extra heads. No one could blame the poor guy considering he was the only one who didn't know his mate was pregnant. "You're pregnant?" he repeated for the 13th time. A laugh exploded from my mouth seconds before Mason wrapped his arms around me and hauled me into his arms. I wriggled against his iron-clad hold, knowing I stood no chance fighting my way out of his grasp. Good thing I didn't need strength to overpower him. I sent a small jolt of magic crackling down my skin, just enough to provoke a reaction. Since Holly and Tristan were being all lovey-dovey, wrapped in each other's arms, the only ones left to notice were Lola and Maddox. "You little cheater, using your magic against me." Mason chuckled in my ear, his voice simultaneously rough and silky. There was a softness to it that stirred the butterflies camping out in my stomach. Dancing out of his grasp, I wiggled my fingers at him. There was a playful tilt to his lips, that when paired with the beard he'd been growing, was devastatingly handsome. His eyes twinkled as he stalked towards me, both emerald and brown depending on the source of lighting. There was once a time where that playfulness was non-existent, where his carefree nature was an act he put on for the world. Despite how much Lola and Brianna cared about him, they never truly realized how much he was suffering inside. I didn't either. Not for a while, anyway. Mason's arm slid around my waist. It didn't take much to send my mind drifting back into the past, to how our relationship first started. Admittedly, I'd gotten on his nerves, but I liked to think that he needed the challenge. More than once we teetered on the verge of enemies, but for the most part, we lingered on the cusp of something more. I sighed when his lips skated along my cheek. His touch was soothing, relaxing in the best way. It was nothing like the otherworldly sparks fated mates felt, but it was close enough. "You know, I wouldn't mind seeing you pregnant. Your skin glowing, stomach round with my child, your scent even sweeter than it is now." My heart skipped a beat. It might have stopped completely if it weren't for my magic. In the 4 years we'd been dating, he had never said anything quite like this. There was so much between us that remained unspoken. Like the topic of his actual mate. "Oh, is that so?" I chuckled, craning my head to smirk up at him. The strands of his light hair fell across his forehead, tickling my nose. A smile spread across his face as I wrinkled my nose and blew the hair out of the way. Despite how relaxed I felt around him, how my feelings had long surpassed a simple crush, the thought of Mason's actual mate was never far from my mind. Lola herself had warned me ahead of time. Hearing the story of how Mason was not only rejected but suffered through his mate's death was agonizing. It was a pain I could never fully understand, but with it came a slew of worries. Would I ever be enough for him? Would he ever truly be happy with me? I hid the dark turn my thoughts had taken behind a smile, but no matter how far my cheeks stretched and how brightly my eyes sparkled with joy for Holly and Tristan's baby, I couldn't help but notice the mating mark on both of their necks. Never have I wanted one so badly. The weeks after Holly's pregnancy announcement blended into one. Each and every morning I'd venture off to work, spending those precious minutes before my shift with Mason, who never once failed to make my lunch. Teaching Witchcraft 101, seeing the beaming faces of my students, became something I was wholly passionate about. Never in my life did I think that I'd be teaching the next generation of witches, watching them learn from the mistakes of the past as they grew in power. Still, even with all this happiness in my life, there was something missing, something I craved more and more with each passing day. Perhaps I was selfish for wanting this when I already had so much, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. Which is exactly why I called on the one person I knew who could help me. "I'm actually really glad you wanted to hang out. Gives me a break from the twins." Lola giggled. She pulled out a chair at the little cafe we were at and took a seat. I'd ordered our coffees ahead of time, along with an assortment of pastries. Given Lola's sweet tooth, I figured she wouldn't have any specific preferences. When a few customers passed, she nodded at them in greeting. How she dealt with the constant string of admirers was beyond me, but that's why she was the one in charge. I smirked, brushing the crumbs from the croissant I'd been picking at off my *P. "They tiring you out already? Those terrible twos sure are something, aren't they?" "Oh, you don't even know the half of it. Lola huffed, snatching her coffee off the table. She scooped the dollop of whipped cream off the top and plopped it into her mouth. Actually, you might considering you're a witch too. Go on, lay it on me. I encouraged her with a smirk. I wish there was some guide for raising twin tribrids. It's a blessing in disguise that only Ramona can use magic, because I'm not sure what I'd do if it were both of them. At least with Maven it's the blood drinking I have to worry about. My eyebrows shot up in surprise. He's 2 years old and already worried about blood. Are you kidding me? He loves the stuff. Loves it more than people food, which is a bit concerning. Tristan and Giovanni say this is normal for a vampire child though. She huffed, her shoulders sagging with relief. Well, it's not unusual for witches to display their magic this early. Especially if they're powerful. I couldn't help but add. Lola had so much on her plate already. Adding 2 magical children to the mix was bound to cause some additional stress. If you ever need some time away, I'd be more than happy to watch them. You know I love your kids. Ramona has been asking about her Aunt Clara and Uncle Mason. Lola chuckled. After taking a deep drink from her coffee, a speculative look crossed her face. Anyway, how have you been doing? You looked a bit distraught at Holly's gender reveal last week. Even though Holly knew her unborn baby was a girl, Lola and I still went through the motions of hosting a big get-together. Holly had little to no normal experiences, and this was one we decided she couldn't do without. That obvious, hey? I muttered, my stomach twisting into knots. On second thought, coffee was probably the last thing I needed during a time like this. I pushed the steaming cup closer to the center of the table, focusing my nerves on a blueberry muffin topped with thick granules of sugar. With a frown painting her face, Lola leaned forward and reached out for my hand. The ridiculously long strands of her ebony hair fell over her shoulder, inches away from the cinnamon bun with its sticky coating. Hey, what's wrong? Things might be different now, but our friendship hasn't changed. If you need anything, you know you only have to ask. I took a deep breath before forcing the words past my lips. Hesitating would only prolong the torture, and I'd put myself through the ringer enough times this past week alone. I was just wondering if werewolves could put their mark on anyone, even if that person wasn't their goddess-given mate. It took a great deal of effort not to cringe at myself. Anyone with 2 ears and a working brain would know who I was talking about. They can, but why would they want? She stopped in her tracks, and this time I did cringe. Understanding flashed in Lola's eyes, making her unnaturally bright blue tones even brighter. Mason never marked her, just so you know. Clara, he'd be a fool not to mark you. I'm sure if you asked him, he'd leap at the chance. My stomach dropped. Suddenly, the blueberry muffin I'd been picking at no longer seemed appetizing. I can't just ask him that. What if he thinks I'm trying to replace his actual mate? What if? What if he doesn't want to? Look, all I know is that he's changed since you came into the picture. Actually, I don't think I've ever seen him this happy before. I think you should take the risk and ask him, Clara. I think his response will surprise you. Lola spoke with such confidence that it was hard not to buy into it. It filled my chest, mingling with the mouth-watering scent of roasted coffee beans and flaky pastries. I took a deep breath and nodded. All right, I'll do it. I'll ask Mason to mark me. Good. I can't wait to see his mark on your neck. Lola winked, beaming at me from across the table. She took another gulp of her coffee, making a sound low in her throat as she gazed at it almost lovingly. Actually, there was something I needed to ask you in return. Oh. I replied, just a tad surprised. "Is it about the magisterium? You already know there's a spot open for Ramona once she becomes of age, but I wouldn't mind starting some basic training with her once she's able to walk and talk. It's not that, but I'll definitely take you up on that offer. This is more about Mason and whether or not you think he'd be interested in a job of sorts." My eyebrows lifted on their own accord. Mason was a warrior by nature, but he didn't have a set job here in the pack. He'd run patrol with some of the others when he was on call, but that was about it. "What's the job for?" I asked. "Well, Maddox's beta is retiring. He's getting up there in age and his mate is pregnant with their fourth. Pretty soon he's going to have a pack of his own to run," Lola said with a giggle. "And well, Maddox was wondering if Mason would take his place." Lola left it to me to reveal the good news, not that I minded one bit. I all but raced home, barging through the front door of our little townhouse with enough speed to send Mason scrambling in the kitchen. "Clara! You scared out of me." His head appeared from around the corner, a lopsided grin spreading across his face. A faint blush stained his cheeks, telling me that I wasn't the only one planning something. "Not expecting me back so soon?" I smirked. "What ya up to?" Mason's eyes widened just a fraction before he disappeared inside the kitchen. There was a series of clanks and bangs that sounded a whole lot like an avalanche of dirty dishes. I crept closer to the kitchen, peeking my head around the corner just in time for Mason to bulldoze his way past. "Actually, I'm not quite done in there yet." He chuckled nervously, rubbing at the back of his neck. No matter how hard I tried to peer around him, he managed to get in the way. With a huff, he guided me by my shoulders into the living room. "What exactly are you up to in there?" I mused, seconds away from making a break into the kitchen. That lopsided grin of his returned, forcing my heart to skip a beat. He flopped down on the couch, then grabbed me by my hips, pulling me down on top of him. A laugh flew past my lips as I settled onto his lap, tangling my fingers in the ends of his overgrown hair. He'd spoken about getting it cut a few times in the past, but I actually loved the rugged look it gave him. "You know how last weekend you and Holly designed your dream houses? Well, I might have borrowed a few pages," he admitted, a hint of emotion twinkling in his eyes. There was obvious excitement, but it was tainted by an uncertainty that bled into his voice. Mason was worried I wouldn't like what he'd done. A beaming smile tugged at my lips, the joy that followed filling my heart until I thought it might burst. No one, not a single person in my life had gone to such lengths for me. I smoothed my fingers over the coarse strands of his beard before pressing my lips against his. When I pulled away, fighting the moisture that gathered in my eyes, my head was swimming. "When do I get to see it?" The obvious eagerness in my voice made his shoulders relax. "It's going to take me some time to buy the rest of the supplies, and before you offer, I don't want any of your money going to this. This is a gift for you." It had been a sore spot between us that I was the only one with a job. Mason had tried a few here and there over the years, but he wasn't passionate about them. This was exactly why the position of beta was perfect for him. Mason loved this pack with his whole heart. I think I have just the solution you're looking for," I hummed, my eyes fluttering shut as he nuzzled his cheek against my own. Each inhale of my scent he took sent a warmth surging lower, one I couldn't focus on if I were going to relay the good news. "Oh, really?" Mason chuckled against my neck, grazing his lips and teeth over the sensitive skin. "You got a job for me, Clara." "Not me. Lola." I gasped. Words were becoming hard, and the more he played my body like a finely tuned instrument, the more I found them slipping away. I distanced myself, planting my hands on his cheeks to steady my thoughts. Mason C0CKED his head to the side. Lola has a job for me. Yes, and the sooner you let me finish, the sooner you can help me out of this dress. I winked. Now I had his full, undivided attention. He sat up straighter, his eyes no longer wandering down to me. The sudden shift coaxed another string of laughter from my mouth. How would you, Mason, feel about becoming the next beta of this pack? Disbelief made his eyes shimmer like amber jewels. They were speckled with fragments of endearing innocence that matched the way his jaw dropped, and voice failed. You. Lola. This can't be. He sputtered, working through the pieces one by one until he managed a strangled, "Are you serious?" Of course, I'm being serious. She told me about it earlier today. You were the first person they thought of for the job. What do you think? What do I think? I think you're amazing. He stared at me as though I were the one to get him the job, when in reality, it was himself. Nibbling on my lower lip, I decided to get on with it and voice what had been weighing on my mind for weeks now. There is something else, something I wanted to ask you. I exhaled slowly. You know you can ask me anything, baby. Mason replied, confusion overshadowing his joy. Here goes nothing. I want you to mark me. Mason blinked several times, his lips opening and closing, though no words came out. A faint spattering of color covered his cheeks, making me wish desperately that my magic had to do with feeling emotions. Goodness, I would have killed to know what he was thinking in this moment. Slowly, a smile unfurled across his face, one that made my heart rate skyrocket. He rummaged through his pocket, fishing out a black velvet box that made my world come to a screeching halt. I'd love to mark you, Clara, but only if you'll marry me. Epilogue, Brianna and Giovanni, 5 years later. Brianna's POV. I appeared in a plume of inky shadow, emerging from the darkness like I'd been there all along. If there were any humans nearby, which my hearing told me there wasn't, they'd see nothing more than a lingering shadow dancing along the brick walls of the abandoned storefront I lurked outside of. This wasn't my ideal hangout spot, but for whatever reason, this was where Freya had chosen to hide a bunch of magical texts and artifacts. I absolutely adored my job of traveling the country via shadows, collecting information that was thought to be lost among the witches. It was similar to what my parents had done, a realization that never failed to bring tears to my eyes. Even after all these years, I missed them so much. I slinked along the back wall, past the rusted dumpsters that hadn't been used in goddess knows how long, to the back door Ember Source promised would be unlocked. Sure enough, when I tugged the handle, it swung open with a metallic GR0AN. The inside of the abandoned store was far worse than the outside led me to believe. Judging from the discarded mildew-stained stands and faded posters, this place used to be some kind of cell phone store. That was long before the Blood Witch, may she not rest in peace, turned this place into her own personal hiding spot. Lola and Clara had been furious when they found out how much information Freya had been hoarding, keeping it for herself to hold over the heads of young witches everywhere. This was exactly why I signed up for the job. If there was one thing my parents believed in wholeheartedly, it was that knowledge should not be kept hidden. Knowledge was meant to be shared with the world. I tiptoed inside, keeping my ears peeled. There was little in the way of light, but I expected as much after eyeing the blown fuse box outside. A quiet scuttle just inside alerted my attention, but as I crept closer, past clusters of soggy boxes and overturned displays, I realized it was a very chunky rat. If I were an evil blood witch with a superiority complex, on destroying the world, where would I hide a bunch of dusty magical texts? I asked myself, lowering my voice halfway through. She had a way of making the smallest of sounds seem louder, and the last thing I needed was to draw attention to myself if any rogue witches were nearby. Starting my search, I thought back to last month and how drastically things had changed. This was my first job since returning from my honeymoon with Giovanni. His parents had this incredible villa in Italy, set in the Tucson countryside. It was surrounded by rolling hills and a vineyard as far as the eye could see. There was even an olive grove, whose owner was more than happy to give Giovanni and I a tour. It was Lola, and her crazy magic, that made all of this possible. She'd given Giovanni and I a wedding present, something we could have never expected. For those 2 weeks in Italy, she'd made Giovanni impervious to the sun. We were able to visit all of the monuments and do all of the wonderful tourist things I had on my list. A dream vacation after a dream wedding. I kicked open one of the soggy boxes, wrinkling my nose at the stench that wafted out. Wet, mildew-covered paper had a stench that was eerily similar to rotting trees. Moving on, I followed the dull tingle of magic in the air, and began searching one of the overturned displays. Grabbing a shard of broken wood off the floor, I nudged one of the display's doors open, humming the first song to pop into my head. The sweet and soft melody that had been frequenting my head the past month was none other than the song played at my wedding. I shared the day with Mason and Clara, a decision I didn't regret in the slightest. The dual aisles split in two by rows upon rows of our closest family and friends was incredible, lined with fresh roses and orbs of starlight that Lola herself had conjured. Even Ember and Tessa had a hand to play in the wedding. There were floating sconces with cobalt flame that flickered the breeze. A breeze which carried the scent of wild flowers from the vines they sprouted on. Marrying Giovanni and having my breath ripped from my lungs as I spotted him in his tux, while also watching my best friend marry the love of his life, was by far the best part. Well, almost. It was a tie, actually. The ceremony had been beautiful, but the reception was another thing entirely. Seeing the look on Mason's face when Clara stood to give an impromptu speech, only to reveal the secret she, Lola, Holly, and I had kept for almost 2 months, was a moment I'd never forget. In fact, I had a picture of said moment tucked away in my wallet. Mason had scooped Clara into his arms, tears cascading down his cheeks, when his bride revealed she was pregnant with his child. There weren't enough words in my vocabulary to express how happy I was for my best friend, and for the joy he had found in his life after enduring so much. The light in his eyes sent me reeling back 5 long years ago, to a conversation I overheard between Sean and Mason. Just 1 month before Sean's murder, I'd nearly walked in on the two of them talking. It was their hushed tones that prompted me to stop, while a tingle in my gut told me to stay and listen. "You like her, she clearly likes you. What's the problem, man?" Sean had asked. It took Mason several seconds to respond. "You don't think it's wrong of me to want her?" "How could it be wrong?" Sean replied. "I had a mate, and I lost her. I can't replace her with Clara." Mason's voice cracked, a shard of it ricocheting off the wall and into my chest. There was a sharp clap, and I assumed Sean had patted Mason on the back. "This is going to sound harsh, but I think you need to hear it. Your mate died, yes. But she also chose to reject you. Spending the rest of your life alone and hurting for a person who couldn't see your worth is a terrible waste. You deserve happiness, even if it's not with the one the moon goddess paired you with." Mason let out a long, shaky sigh, followed by a half-hearted chuckle. "You sound just like Lola, you know? How come you haven't moved on from your mate? I haven't met anyone quiet like Kenyon." "You're lucky, Mason. It's different when you've completed the bond. Part of you dies with them, and that part of me knows Kenyon is out there waiting until we're together again. It was funny to think that Lola's brother was responsible for Clara and Mason getting together. Sean had been more right than he could have ever known. Aha! I gasped, kicking open yet another door on an overturned display. This time, instead of old phone cases and corroded wires, I found a box completely untouched by the water damage infesting this place. After a quick victory dance that resulted in me kicking the door and sending it flying off its hinges, I bent down to slide the box out of its hiding place. Sure enough, inside was 4 different books, each one named after one form of magic or another. I scooped them into my arms and made quick work of slinking back into the shadows, willing the slippery little bastards to transport me somewhere else to the very person who sent me on this mission. "You're late." Ember's snarky voice permeated the room I teleported into. The stone-crafted fireplace to my left was the only source of light, casting a number of shadows along the heavily decorated walls. I slapped the box of spell books onto the nearest table before propping my hand on my HP. Narrowing my eyes at the redhead, I spat back. "Easy for you to say. How long has you been in that cushy chair?" 3 hours? 4. A smirk twitched onto her face. 5, but who's counting? Laughter rumbled in my chest, leaving my mouth the same time it left Ember's. I approached the massive executive desk with my arms outstretched. She met me halfway, pulling me into a hug that all but enveloped me in her cinnamon apple scent. "It's good to see you, Ember." I stepped out of her grasp, eyeing the emerald green pantsuit she had on. It was adorned with golden buttons that matched the dainty chain around her neck, a gift from Brandon that she begrudgingly accepted only after he threatened her into it. I made absolutely no attempts to understand their relationship. "It's good to see you too. I've been swamped with work, and I'll admit, it's nice to see a friendly face." She winked. With the box of spell books forgotten, we spend the next hour chatting, catching up with one another's lives. I told her all about my honeymoon and the adventures Giovanni and I shared, while she both complained and bragged about her hectic schedule bouncing between not 1, but 2 jobs. Another magisterium had been built last year, this one in Zeke's pack. Ember leaped at the chance to take over as headmaster, even though she was already acting as ambassador to the witches. The only thing keeping her from prematurely graying under the workload was the fact that both jobs often went hand in hand. "Encounter any rogue witches?" Ember asked offhandedly, as she always did when I returned on one of my missions. Propping my feet up on the cushioned footstool perched in front of the chair I sat on, I shook my head. "Nope, sure didn't. From what I could pick up scent-wise, there hadn't been anyone around in weeks." "Good, good. I really hate sending them to the tower, but I know it's a necessary evil." My stomach twisted at the mention of the witch prison Lola, Ember, and a few of the others had created. It was the only place on this earth strong enough to contain witches that dabbled in dark magic. Using conjuration, Lola created a tower in the middle of the ocean that could only be accessed through special doorways planted in both Maddox and Zeke's packs. As the only person able to transport themselves through the shadows, I was often stuck escorting prisoners to and from various places. Lola had put so much effort and energy into the tower that she was out of commission for over 2 weeks. Maddox still hadn't let her live it down, but through her crazed efforts, the Tower of Delirium was born. I still found the place horribly chilling. A tower comprised of snow-white brick, so pale that one could see their reflection in its surface, perched out in the middle of the ocean. Once inside its walls, there wasn't a magic on the face of this earth that could be used. Not even my shadow abilities, which was scary. I think that elemental magic for beginners and potions, elixirs, and more would be better suited in Lola's pack, don't you think? Ember mused, her eyes scanning some of the pages scattered around her desk. Her voice carved through my thoughts, chasing away the chill that the tower never failed to evoke. They held the respective student populations for both schools, along with the various magical types. Seeing as the magisterium back home had more elementals than in Zeke's pack, it only made sense to send the spell book home. Either way, its pages would be scanned and entered into the Academy's database so that all witches would have access to the knowledge. Works for me. I nodded, sipping on the tea Ember had given me. The herbal mixture was a bit tart from the orange peels inside, but even they failed to hide the undertone of bitterness. Noticing the grimace on my face, Ember smirked. Tastes like ass, doesn't it? I promise it'll help ease your nerves. It's the least I can do. Her eyes flickered downwards, to the apex of my stomach. Have you told him yet? I swallowed a gulp of the lukewarm liquid, an inkling of unease squirming in my chest. It hadn't taken much for Giovanni to get me pregnant. In fact, it was all happening so quickly that I often wondered if some other force was at play. No, not yet. I'm working up to it. I sighed, brushing the strands of hair that had fallen out of my high pony from my face. Ember nodded understandingly, but her lips were knitted tightly together. Was Lola able to figure out why the baby is interfering with your shadow abilities? My hand drifted to my stomach on its own accord. Even though the life cooking away inside my body was a vast sea of unknowns, it was one I wanted to tread regardless. It wasn't just a piece of myself, but of the mate I loved with every fiber of my being. The most she can deduce is that the baby is inheriting its own shadow abilities. We won't know more until it's born, but I'm hoping it doesn't mess with them any further. I was only a month along, barely noticeable apart from the fact that this little nugget somehow had the strength to screw with my shadow abilities. I'd be relaxing in bed, or taking a calming bath when the shadows would begin to slither over my body, seconds away from plopping MNE someplace new. Each time I managed to stop it before I actually vanished, but my fear was that with the passing months, my child's power would grow. Ember's eyebrows went up, just as mine had when Lola hit me with her theory. She thinks your child is inheriting shadow abilities. That's what she said. You know, I kind of liked being the first wolf to have this kind of power, but now that my baby is involved, I'm honestly terrified. I don't know what my body is creating. What if it's a monster? I felt terrible to think these thoughts about the life I had helped to create, but the possibilities for this to go horribly wrong were endless. Ember leaned back in her chair, practically swallowed whole by the silk cushion. She crossed her arms over her chest, and from the twinkle in her eye, I could tell she was about to speak with her usual dose of brutal honesty. Lola was playing with the fabric of reality by turning you into what you are. Like it or not, these sorts of things have consequences. This is one of them. I sank my teeth into my lower lip to stifle a pitiful whine. What am I going to do? After being taken, my wolf spent too much time with the shadows. Lola isn't comfortable changing me back to normal. When the time comes and your baby is born, no matter what it is or what it's capable of, we'll all be there to help you. Even with so much left to the unknown, the promise of one of my newest and dearest friends was enough to soothe the jagged shards of my fear. If only it could erase it completely. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.